Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Trinity Grammar School. Whether you are joining us here in person or whether you are joining us online, it is good that you've made the time to be here this evening. My name is Tim Bowden, and it's my honour to be the 11th headmaster of Trinity Grammar School. And the school is delighted to have this opportunity tonight to honour our 9th headmaster, Mr Roderick West, through our hosting of this event tonight. Although my role at this point is very simple and very straightforward, I do want to particularly acknowledge Dr Janet West and her children and grandchildren in coming tonight. It's our pleasure to welcome you back to the school. As we commence, I'd like to... Oh, excellent idea. As we commence, I'd like to acknowledge that the land upon which this school stands is the traditional land of the Wongal people of the Eora Nation. And for generations immemorial, they have raised their young people here. They've taught them the knowledge and the skills, the cultures and traditions, the values and the beliefs that they needed to thrive in their world. And we continue in that same noble task today. We look towards a future where reconciliation is a reality for all Australians. And I want to honour our First Nations leaders, past, present and emerging, and any Indigenous Australians who are present with us this evening. As I said, my role is very brief. Beyond the welcome and acknowledgement of country, it remains for me simply to acknowledge our great God, in whose name we gather tonight, and therefore I will lead us in prayer. Will you please bow your heads as I pray? God of all truth, teach us to love you with heart and mind. Bless our schools and all places of learning in our nation, that they may be lively centres for sound learning, for new discovery, and for the pursuit of wisdom. May all who teach and all who learn seek and love the truth, and in humility look to you, the source of all wisdom and understanding. We thank you for those who serve in our schools, particularly those who take on the responsibility of leadership. Grant to them wisdom, stamina, and faithfulness. We ask your blessing on our time together this evening. Refresh us, we pray, for the work of tomorrow. In Jesus' name, amen. Dr David Hastie.
Well, welcome all to the inaugural Rod West address on Christian leadership in education. It's a wonderful privilege to be here, and it was a great privilege to be part of the organising committee that started just pre-COVID, to think about how we might honour the memory of Rod West and think about how we might advance the cause of Christian leadership in education, particularly through an endowed Professorial Chair. To live well is to be in a state of gratitude, isn't it? Perpetual gratitude, and to pay tribute where it is due and in the season that it is due. I suppose the greatest sense of this is worship, but in the human sense it is honour. And that's what we're doing here tonight. This is about tribute, and it's about legacy, and it's about honour. And so, of course, I don't need to introduce the next speaker, who's paying his own version of tribute. He's coming to us via video recording. Apologies from Mr Howard. He's not able to be here tonight. I don't need to introduce Mr Howard. If I do, perhaps our schooling system has failed. I'm not sure. The second longest Australian serving Prime Minister, who set the political and social framework for a generation. I was talking to one of our marketing people, Luke, and he said, I was born when John Howard was Prime Minister, and he was like the Queen. That's all I ever knew. So shaped a generation. And the key connection between Mr Howard and Rod West was what became known as the West Review of Australian tertiary education generally. The tertiary scene has changed significantly since then, as Mr Howard will reflect upon, and not always for the better. There are some interesting developments, of course, in the elevation of 4 new self-accrediting higher education providers to university college status. And I would say in the same way that more colleges' elevation to university college status is a very significant thing for the training of Anglican ministers, the recent elevation of Alpha Crucis College to university college status is a very significant thing for the training of teachers and leaders in Christian-affiliated schools. And so we come to the theme tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the Honourable John Howard.
I very warmly welcome the moves now underway to establish a Professorial Chair in Christian Leadership, the name of Rod and Janet West. Both of them gave enormously to education, particularly Christian education, throughout their lives. Rod had a stellar career as the headmaster of Trinity Grammar, where he shaped and nurtured many young lives of men who went on to make a remarkable contribution to our society. And of course, he carried out a very hard-hitting review of tertiary education in Australia. I can but speculate as to what he might think of some of the developments now occurring in our universities. It was a great report. It didn't please everybody, which meant that it was a good report. Those reports that please everybody are really of dubious long-term value. To him and to all others who were involved over the years in nurturing Christian education, we must understand that we've now entered a phase where, in a sense, the fight back has begun. 20 or 30 years ago, there were many aspects of our Christian heritage that were accepted without demur. That is no longer the case. Many of them are now contested in a way that would have been unimaginable only a short period of time ago. That is why establishing a Professorial Chair in Christian education leadership is so very important. And those who've associated themselves with that endeavour tonight, those who are making contributions to the context in which this effort is underway, are to be thanked and congratulated. We honour Rod and Janet West. We thank them for the contribution that they made to the development of a proper Christian context for education, and most importantly, we encourage people to support an endeavour that will give practical expression to the commitment and the concern of many to preserve those aspects of our Christian heritage which are so important to the society we've built and so important to the ethos of our nation. Thank you.
I get to speak twice tonight, but briefly, much to the relief of everyone, although being here this evening is, to use the modern phrase, quite a triggering event. The James Wilson Hogg Assembly Hall, which once just went straight out there with a parquetry floor going back, and we had weekly assemblies on Tuesdays here, was in 1988 the scene of one of the celebratory occasions for the 75th anniversary. The school, I'm blaming Rod, in its wisdom, fed the boys cake, gave them a bag of lollies, and then said, there's a concert up in the assembly hall. And Peter Welsh looked at me and said, Tim, you're a housemaster, you go up and look after me, they'll be all right. Well, 1,100 boys with the cockroaches, sugared to the eyeballs. Nobody died. So I reckon that that's the triumph of my schoolmastering career. But it is a pleasure to be here. For those of you who may not be aware, I was asked by Alpha Crucis to chair a committee that started looking at this project some years ago. And as David mentioned, COVID has somewhat got in the way. We had hoped to have had this lecture in 2020. And the idea was to start moving towards the establishment of a Professorial Chair in Christian leadership, and a little bit more of that. But my task tonight is actually to introduce our guest keynote. In the early 1980s, Rod decided that if Trinity was to advance, that one of the things he needed to do was to go out, identify young Christian teachers, and bring them into the school and use them to establish both a strong Christian witness and ethos and a strong academic standard. And I know that two of those are here tonight. I can see Graham Anderson in front of me, and of course Phil Heath was one of the others. I was a somewhat later arrival, and as my wife said, only given the job due to the diameter of my neck. But Phillip Heath is a well-known figure. He came here as a young schoolmaster. He went to Ely on exchange, came back to take on the boarding house. So one of his first big challenges was a major cultural change in boarding at Trinity. And he took that on with great spirit with Alison, and they worked hard on that before he was promoted, dispatched, translated, one of the others, to become deputy head of a young school in the northwest of the city called William Clark College, which now, of course, is one of the preeminent independent schools in the city. And so Phil made a huge contribution there. And then he went to St Andrews to be headmaster in a school that was struggling for enrolments and to some extent needed to be revisioned. And Phil went there with a sturdy Christian faith and a determination. And one of the things that has characterised Phil throughout his life, just the most remarkable ability to get on with young people and talk to them. And if you go up to Barker today and you walk around with Phil, he just, again, seems to know everybody's name. So he picked up that from Rod. Phil then went, at the end of 14 years of outstanding service at St Andrews, where he transformed the school. It went co-ed. And he was looking for a new challenge, so he went down to Canberra, to Radford, and he was happily settled there, doing a great job. But I had sort of the back of my mind, as many people in Sydney did, that when Barker came up, they were going to really try and get Phil to go there, which in due course he did in 2013. On the way through this process, Phil really got motivated, challenged about the work of education for Indigenous young people. We in this country, of course, we talk a lot about how we might close gaps and other things. But in actual fact, if we're going to change lives, one of the things we've got to do is give quality education to young Indigenous people. And Phil started that journey at St Andrews. He maintained his interest at Radford. And of course, he is radically pursuing that at Barker with establishment of schools on the Central Coast and in Arnhem Land for young Indigenous people. He's widely regarded as a natural leader of education in this country, and the AHISA organisation recognised that when he was National Chair for 2 years as well. But people come from all over to talk to Phillip about ideas, initiatives, and what to do about the challenge of being responsible educators for Indigenous Australians. He was recognised by the Australian honours system with an AM, and a thoroughly deserved one for all his contributions. And so I, for one, am looking forward to hearing my very good close friend and esteemed colleague, Phil Heath, as he speaks to us tonight. Welcome, Phil.
Thank you. I was hearing about that person. I think I'd really like to meet that person. He sounds a very interesting person. Thank you very much, Tim, for that really lovely welcome. I have to say, I have similar memories of that spectacular day in 1988 with lollies being thrown at the cockroaches. But I also remember something else that happened in here. It was the speech night a few years earlier than that. We were, all of us, sub-fusk on the stage, and Ron Ogier, who would be known to some in this room, who had quite a sense of humour, was the person who assisted the headmaster by handing the prize to the headmaster before it was handed then to the grateful recipient. Nancy Bird Walton was the speaker, famously on that night, had been asked to speak for about 12 minutes. It was about an hour and a half later that finally the prizes began to be distributed. And of course, the students were not patient about this, but at one point, behind the academic gown, Ron Ogier held up the title of a famous book that was to be handed out. It said, "Endless Night" was the title. And the staff lost it. Grateful relief for some kind of humour on a difficult night. Mr Bowden, what a joy it is to be in your school, and how proud we are of you and your leadership in Christian education. Mrs West, Mrs West, it's such a joy to see you and the family, and I honour you greatly, as I hope you will hear. And those of you who are gathered in this place, distinguished guests, the board of Alpha Crucis University College, and congratulations on that elevation. It's really quite considerable, something to really enjoy. And to those who know and love Christian education, and in particular, know and love the figure that tonight we celebrate and honour for all that he means to all of us and the inspiration that he continues to breathe into our lives. To members of the West family, of course, what a joy it is to see you tonight. And it's lovely that you're here, Angel. It really means a lot. Let me attempt some Darug language by my own acknowledgement of country. Nero dia mirang, narag darag wongo, and garigal yura. Barangay, yagu yur barani. Nalawawa Barker, Baya Digitagura Darug, Darkanjung Wanarua, Yolnu, Yua Jagala Nura, Nala Yaban, Yama, Baya Nogabadi Darug, Wanago, Darkanjung, Wanarua, Yua, Yolnu, Yora. And if I could borrow some Yolnu Mata from northeast Arnhem Land, Gulalu Bukmak, Nara Yaku Philip, Mainmak Nara, Mainmak Dwala. To all of us, welcome tonight on this country. I said in Yolnu Mata there, my name is Phillip Heath, welcome to everybody. I am well, it's good to be here. And we are here for a great occasion, to give the inaugural Roderick West oration, an educator whose beach towel and flip-flops I was unworthy to carry. And the address will attempt three themes. The first is to reflect a bit on the character and legacy of Rod West. That's a tall order in a short-ish address. The second will be to consider the historical context in which the education of the heart unfolded. What are the similarities and what are the differences to our own generation? And then thirdly, I want to consider whether the contemporary experience in which the heart of education is now unfolding is burdened by a pain such that we are experiencing a loss of meaning, where even leadership itself in the Rod West manner is imperilled. And I want to then propose that it is time for a new heart in education that must be expressed in radical hope, just as the incurably optimistic Rod West would have sought if he had still been with us, even when the paradigms of leadership themselves are under attack, even when the very idea of leadership is now being deeply questioned and even doubted. So let me first of all look at the character and legacy of Roderick West. Malcolm Brown, in his obituary to Roderick Ian West, published in the Sydney Morning Herald on the 2nd of February 2016 under the title Headmaster Who Inspired Thousands of Pupils and Teachers, said this: West was appointed headmaster of Trinity Grammar School at the age of 39 and started the following year in 1975. He blossomed to become one of the country's great headmasters. Academic standards soared. From 1978, Trinity was rarely out of the top 10 schools in the state in the HSC. Now, the obituary continued to list some of the distinguished people who flourished under Rod West's inspiring hand. And the obituary refers to perhaps his most famous pupil, that is Prince Charles at Timbertop. And here, in this place, amongst the playing fields and classrooms and halls and the lovely facilities of Trinity Grammar School, he developed a kind of nursery for leadership and influence, which the obituary acknowledged. I quote again, "Of the teachers who worked under West, 31 went on to become headmasters or school principals, including Dr. Tim Wright, headmaster of the Shore School, Phillip Heath, headmaster of Barker College, and Graham Anderson, headmaster of Arden Anglican School." The obituary continued, "Evangelical in terms of doctrine, but favouring a breadth of vision, West was, for years, a member of the Sydney Anglican Synod. At least 50 boys whom he instructed went on to become ministers of religion, including 44 Anglicans." This is a powerful legacy that's lived deep into this century and will continue. And fittingly, the role of Janet West, née Conti, was also recognised in that same obituary and should be acknowledged tonight. An educator, a playwright, a poet, and an historian in her own right, Janet West was absolutely steadfast in her support for Rod and for this community. And whilst temperamentally vastly different, they were utterly complementary in intellect and in passion. Now, as Tim very kindly said, I first met Rod West in late 1980. The school had embarked on the daring task of increasing the size of Year 7 from 4 streams to 6 streams, and they needed to augment the number of teachers. I had, by that time, submitted my honours thesis on Reformation history, supervised by the flamboyant and perceptive mind of Dr. Stuart Piggin. Stuart Piggin had found the history department at the University of Wollongong, where we studied, as repressively and aggressively secular. And he also encouraged those same thoughts amongst his students. But he had an immense impact on so many of us. Somewhat like Thomas Chalmers of St Andrews University, Scotland, Stuart demonstrated that the study of Christian experience could be a deeply intellectual as well as spiritual passion, but it must adhere to the highest standards of historical scholarship that could have been attainable, especially when it was set in the context of an avowedly secular department such as the history department at the University of Wollongong, which resented Stuart's popularity and the frequency with which students wanted to study under him in the pursuit of understanding church history. The work of Stuart Piggin's students was regarded by many in the department with suspicion, and several of us who were his students fell into that maelstrom during those years. The preferred study of that faculty was labour history and the experience of socialism as far more favoured than Christian thought. Despite this, I achieved a first-class honours degree by stumbling upon an extensive debate on the theology of redemption as articulated by 17th century English Puritans John Owen and Richard Baxter. To spend a year of my life embedded in the theology of redemption, as contrastingly understood by 2 giants of Puritan thinking, was an almost incalculable privilege for me. A former captain of a very modest Catholic school in Bellambi in Wollongong, growing up in fibro housing, in housing commission accommodation, surrounded by brothers and the only one who finished high school. and I experienced a reformation of my own, of sorts, by Stuart's ministrations. And I was tempted, I must admit, by the great notion of pursuing further research and writing in church history. Indeed, I began to read John Wesley's Theology of Holiness as a PhD topic. But penury and an approaching marriage began to admit other thoughts. And so Stuart Piggott, in a weak moment, must have mentioned my name to his uncle, Rod West, the headmaster of Trinity. I can think of absolutely no other reason why Mr West would be willing to meet someone like me, who grew up where I did, in the dwellings of Sandon Point in the northern suburbs of Wollongong, now fashionable, but back then not so much. I can well recall my first visit to Trinity on one of those perishingly hot afternoons in November when the early summer strikes. I was enthralled beyond words to see the boys of the first 11 cricket team clad in whites training on the centre wicket of the Trinity main oval. I had only ever seen schoolboy cricket on concrete pitches, and if they were very fortunate, with Koya mats. That was my experience of cricket. And our interview for the history post at Trinity consisted chiefly of discussing the piety of the Moravians and their contribution to Christian mission. He asked me nothing at all about the Year 7 English and History sets that I would be allocated as a 22-year-old a few weeks later. Afternoon tea was brought in by a kindly kitchen staff member. That impressed me enormously. To the headmaster's study on a lovely tray, and there were mint slice biscuits on the tray. Now, why do I remember that? I politely accepted a glass of water. It was a hot day, and a mint slice, feeling that it was the right thing to do. But I quickly regretted it when Rod West grabbed a mint slice biscuit, asked me a question, and then placed the entire mint slice in his mouth while he waited for me to reply. The chocolate coating of a mint slice biscuit does not fare well with the Australian summer at the best of times, and that was not the best of times. It was fiendishly hot. And when held between the thumb and the forefinger, it does not fare well. As the chocolate began to drip down my fingers to the sleeve of my new shirt, which I just bought for the occasion, and my new suit, which I had saved up for, I was deeply embarrassed. But Rod either didn't notice or was so consumed by the conversation about the Moravians or so fanatical about the whole experience of inviting a new person into the experience of education, he offered me the teaching position anyway. And the rest, as they say, was history. Rod West saw in me capacity that I certainly had given no thought to being possible. This was one of his many gifts. And I was, as we have heard, far from the only recipient. He took boundless trouble to know his people, who I regard myself as one of the least, and to nourish any morsel of potential that he saw in them. I was one of the beneficiaries of this astounding quality. He expected a Herculean effort from himself, and he called upon others to follow in the same manner. The common room chatter often voiced the view that it would have been wonderful to be a boy at Trinity under Rod West, because it was actually exceedingly demanding to be one of his staff members. Rod expected the rigours that he imposed on himself would be willingly replicated by his staff. And I found it inspiring, but was faintly distressed when I saw the resentment that it could sometimes create in the common room. I remember vividly, as I'm sure Tim will, the rain dances that were comically performed by the maths department in the bay windows of the then common room overlooking the main oval to bring about the cancellation of Saturday games. And it unsettled my idealistic sentiments. And it certainly would have distressed the headmaster had he ever known. But he made no apology in his quest to be the complete schoolmaster, as he saw it. He expected all of Trinity to understand that and to pursue it as a lifestyle choice, if anybody who wanted to serve in an aspiring school. Now, even my faltering footsteps along the way that he would set would be met with enthusiasm that was in fact irresistible. You felt that you were the only person in the world when he spoke to you. Unconcerned about barriers such as age or experience, Rod West would call you into the most formidable settings without a shadow of doubt in you. If you had doubts, Rod would drive through them and just say, just go and do it. A day house master, as we've heard, a boarding master, exchange in the UK, the writer of the school's 25th anniversary history, all in my 20s. Completely undeserved. And Rod never wavered in his confident support of people that he trusted and called into doing something important. Rod West did not appoint staff, as we might now understand a contracted position under a human resources framework. He called them. And he called them into a sublime quest to educate, and to educate his boys at Trinity. That was a calling of voca. We were called out to do something bigger than us. And this education would be accomplished in a loving, sacrificial, and ambitious manner, following his lead as the complete schoolmaster in the finest tradition of that notion. And to be the complete Christian in the process, where the character of Christ permeated every thought and action. Like the apostles on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, we were called, in a sense, to leave everything behind and follow him to the wondrous world of service in education. And there are several colleagues who were with me in that time who know exactly what I'm talking about. Late in the night, Rod would return to his study to complete the day's administration, clear his correspondence, answer memos or write them, and work on papers. He would occasionally call the housemaster's phone, and we had a little signal. He would ring 3 times and hang up, which was a signal that I should visit him if I was still awake or otherwise available and not in the house. Sometimes over a glass of sherry, he would recount to me stories of his time in Baker House at King's, or his time in the UK, or his early difficult years here at Trinity. He loved to recount the things that happened to him and his formation, his missteps, and at times he was unguarded, self-deprecating, and deeply honest. And he set the direction that he wanted to see in Schoolhouse, but he didn't set it by listing out a series of tasks or proposing a series of goals, but by laying bare what he saw as the essence of community life, and then stepping back and letting me try. And this practice in good leadership would particularly be focused on winning over the resisting soul of the recalcitrant youth. Go out to them, find them, and call them into opportunities that were different and perhaps surprising for themselves. He extolled the virtue to me of appearing in the house at unexpected times, especially late in the evening, and yarning to the senior boys who were studying. They were, as, to use his words, as open as Botany Bay at such times. And this is when the real impact, he said, could be made on their formation. Late in the evening, when they were not expecting you to appear, was when their souls were ready to be laid bare. Now, in this case, it was a lasting impact. In my own way, I walked that pathway, but never compellingly. But his impact on his own students, particularly in the boarding years, was never contrived. A few weeks ago, I received an unexpected note from Marty Woods, who had been a member of Baker House within the King's School during Rod West's time as housemaster. Some in this room will know Marty Woods. We were members of St James Parish here in Croydon together for some years, and we met again after that lengthy break at Rod's funeral a few years ago. And he wrote this to me: "You may know that we moved to Japan 3 years ago to help with the Games outreach. Now we have committed to another 3. I mentor 17 Japanese young men and a number of others around the world. I'm just about finished a book on mentoring that I'm dedicated to Jenny and to Rod. Rod taught me how to be a mentor. He let me mentor the Year 7 boys. I have never forgotten his trust. Rod was a father to me. A struggling adolescent saw in Rod what the Good Shepherd looked like. He was an attractor for the kingdom, and I knew I wanted in. I smile each time I read the story of Elisha asking Elijah for double of his spirit. Well, I feel that if I had even half of Rod's spirit, I'd be outstanding. Every year on Samuel's death, Samuel was their little boy who passed away in infancy. Every year on Samuel's death, on Samuel's anniversary, wherever we were in the world, Rod would send a note to recall and grieve with us. He drove 600 kilometres on hearing of Samuel's death to see us. I will never forget how he walked into the hospital with such love and compassion. I want to be like that. So Marty Woods of Baker House, student under Rod West, said to me, Phillip Heath, a student under Rod West in a very different context some years later. In that note, Marty also included a poem written by Adrian Lane, another Baker House boy during Rod's final days. It is evidence, if any evidence was needed, of the lifelong impact of heart-filled leadership. Adrian speaks in his poem of Joshua 1:9 and quotes the beautiful old hymn, "When I tread the verge of Jordan, bid my anxious fears subside. Death of death and hell's destruction, land me safe on Canaan's side. Songs of praises, I will ever give to thee. I will ever give to thee." And the poem then reflects on his personal experience of Rod's own ministry. And it finishes with these words: Yet God takes your very breaks and makes a strength and makes a life. Thank God he gave us a long afternoon uninterrupted to talk about old times, people, and the certain hope of heaven. You've said all these prayers over many years and always believed them, but now they flow with precious power to bring a holy balm, strong and courageous, as you fight this final fight. The promised land awaits, safe in the shepherd's arms. Now cracks a noble heart, says Horatio of the Death of Hamlet, but Rod West was more Mark Antony, full of passion and purpose and design than Hamlet, who was racked by doubts and procrastination. But there were doubts and there were missteps, but rarely doubts about his purpose and procrastination about its pursuit. Rod West's life and complexities was a study in cultural and symbolic leadership of the highest order, and probably is without contemporary or even present parallel, save but in aspiration. His actions were intentional, and he trusted his own instincts. He was compelled by the love of Christ and his boundless dedication to the cause. He actually knew his impact, and he trusted it. Now, in the words of Graham Anderson, who edited Rod West's memoir, The Heart of Education, he wrote to me in the course of preparing this oration tonight. He said this: again, it's Rod's humility and finding a great purpose / passion Without being the academic or the sportsman, he was not sporty. But his ability to convince, influence, to make you feel like you're the only one in the world with him. No greater example when he was literally dying and phone calls were coming in from all over the world at his deathbed. He made the caller unique. I just listened and watched, and he comforted them rather than vice versa. That ends the quote. Towards the end of his career as headmaster at Trinity, Rod West's memoir recounts the appalling experience of the murder of Year 10 student Peter Savage in August of 1995. As Tim mentioned, by that time I had become the head of St Andrew's Cathedral School in the city, and the senseless murder of a schoolboy for what appeared to be no other motive than the contents of his wallet sent waves of horror and fear throughout my community and indeed many independent school communities in Sydney. Under the heading The Intangibles, in his book, Rod reflected on the experience of his time, the experience of his school in such a time of grieving. Now, many of us here know that Rod loved the visceral symbolism of funeral ceremonies. He loved them. And he hosted many in his time in that beautiful chapel. They had a powerful impact on all of us who were there, especially when the story was about a departing student, such as Peter Savage or Andrew Haslam or Piers Ganzebakken and others, to name but a few. In perhaps the most profound line in his memoir, Rod pondered the end of education. Let me just try to get this up. The end of education is the transmission of loving personality. At the heart of education is the education of the heart. The transmission of loving personality. There is perhaps no higher purpose for education, but the task is made almost unreachable by the contemporary obsession with performance and achievement ranks and league tables. How can you do both? The transmission of the loving personality that accepts everybody as they are and goes out to seek and save, to bring back the lost sheep, leaving the other 99 to care for themselves, and at the same time ensure performance on achievement scales. As we know, Rod West was controversially appointed as headmaster from the post of housemaster at Baker House within the King's School. This was viewed as scandalous at the time. Too rapid a rise for an ambitious ideologue who had been elevated before his due time as a deputy headmaster. He stepped out of line, and the suspicion quickly developed into resentment. His early years, as we know, at Trinity, followed the venerated and adored James Wilson Hogg, himself one of the great headmasters of his generation in Australia. I counted an incalculable gift to me that I was able to interview and research James Wilson Hogg's headship while I was preparing for the book Trinity, the Daring of Your Name. I spent many hours speaking with Mr Hogg, understanding him, and I too revered him, as I think we all did. Mr Hogg, in the course of that research, recounted to me the advice that he offered to young Rod West before starting at the school in 1975. He said this: change something soon after you arrive. You and I are different, and they must know that. Then that ends the quote. Now, Rod never shared this with me in the preparation of the same work, but Mr Hogg had indicated. But the truth is that any even casual observer of the Trinity history and even the kindest admirer of Mr Hogg would know that in his final years, in the early to mid-1970s, some aspects of life of the school had perhaps begun to deteriorate. The academic and sporting program needed prompt attention from the new headmaster. However, advising Rod West to change something soon after you arrive was akin to saying to Gina Reinhardt, keep searching for new minds. By his own admission, Rod West's early days as headmaster were plagued by naivety, conflict, and frustration that nearly overwhelmed him. After the public humiliation of the disastrous speech night of 1976, Rod felt it was necessary to resign his headship in defeat. It was one of the lowest points of his career, perhaps of his life. The extraordinary legacy that tonight we are honouring may never have eventuated, were it not for the wise counsel of Archbishop Sir Marcus Lone. When Rod confided in the Archbishop after such a public display of disloyalty and division, as they left the speech night, he said, Archbishop, as headmaster, I think I need to resign. And Marcus Lone made what should now be regarded as one of the most famous declarations. Nonsense, he said in that tone of his. This is a time to build. In other words, self-doubt and even defeat is not the end. In some ways, being eviscerated in that way may well even be the beginning. Now, Julia Anstey was here tonight. Julia West shared a treasure that she found in her father's papers. A letter from Rod West's headmaster at the King's School, dated Christmas Eve 1974. When tracing the influences on West's formation as headmaster, the letter from Canon Stanley Curl to Rod West before the latter's commencement at Trinity is a fascinating source. Not expected to read all that, by the way. It's just evidence that a lovingly penned letter was produced by Canon Curl to Rod West. And it reads this, Canon Curl, in an air letter from Greece, dates 13th of the 9th, 1974, you requested some, quote, words of wisdom on headmastering, end quote. I have jotted down a few thoughts in a notebook since then. Here is a summary of them in no particular order. I would like to have given examples, but dare not, remembering the demands of Christian charity and the possibility of libel action. Curl comments on the relentless pressures of headmastering. He says this, like housemastering, headmastering is a labour-intensive activity. You will spend 12 to 14 hours a day in term time, 40 weeks a year, no relief at exam time or during core camps, in personal relationships. In contrast to medical practitioners who can concentrate on a part of the body, or a solicitor who spends time in an interview or over deeds or contracts, a headmaster's relationships are an eyeball-to-eyeball experience. Headmaster and parent, headmaster and boy, headmaster and a member of staff, headmaster and secretary, headmaster and bursar, headmaster and visitors, etc. There is no let-up, no opportunity to drop your eyes, no opportunity to relax. It really is intensive, and so by the end of a day, exhausting. I want to suggest a little later that not only is it an underestimation to say 12 to 14 hours, but the penetrating impact of social media and email makes it very difficult to actually end a day at all in the role. On the complexity of relationships, Canon Curl gave all sorts of advice about dealing with what he referred to as immaturity. You expect it, says Canon Curl, amongst the boys, most of whom are immature young adults, but be prepared for it amongst staff, and strangely amongst parents, particularly fathers. The marks of immaturity, and he goes on to illustrate what you should look for. What can you do about immaturity in adults, particularly staff? He goes on, mostly they are able, enthusiastic and hard-working when their own particular interests are involved, and some are easily to relate to and communicate with the young. So you'll have to learn to live with them and be patient with them. Praise them when you are able, and when an opportune moment arises, rebuke them gently, for they are always prickly. Above all, hope that they will grow up as they grow older. He talked about punishment in schools. He talked about relationship with school councils. And he concludes with these words. He was parsimonious, Canon Curl, with his praise of everybody, but particularly was abstemious with his praise of Rod West. But he described Rod West as the most effective housemaster at the King's School. He said this, "There is much more to be written of your function as headmaster to define teaching and to maintain standards of all types to boys and staff, and of the need to enthuse staff, or the constant need to keep balance between the individual good and the good of the school, or the need to strike a balance between strength and the ability or humility to compromise. Be assured," he says, "that I will watch you with the greatest interest and your growth into headmastering. You quickly developed into the most effective housemaster in this school. There is every reason to believe that you will develop into the most effective headmaster. Yours sincerely, Stanley Curl." Canon Curl was on the council of St Andrew's Cathedral School when I commenced my first headship in 1995. Together with Miss Joyce Gibbons, the retired principal of Kambala School, these two experienced educators offered boundless sagacity to me in my own troubled commencement in my work. I well recall Canon Curl expressing to the school council of St Andrews in my presence, "The new headmaster," he says, "has the support of Year 12, and this is essential for future success. He is doing superbly." He said that about me in my presence. With the copious financial, reputational, and enrolment difficulties that we were facing then, I did not feel any sense of optimism at all about my own capacity to meet those needs. But what he said gave me incredible encouragement. And I suspect that it might well have been Canon Curl's understated wisdom and passion that lends it power. Parsimonious with praise, when praise comes, it's all the more cherished. And although written nearly 5 decades ago, his letter to Rod West still remains applicable today. In summary, Rod West possessed the vision, the capacity, the oratory, the careless bravery, the abiding humility, and the powerful, even romantic sense of Christian mission in education to lead not only a school to excellence, but to inspire a generation of Christian leaders, of whom the speaker tonight is but the least. Let me now turn quickly to the historical context in which the education of the heart unfolded. And in doing so, a disturbing question emerges. Can the qualities that I have described be replicated and adapted in a new era? How much of the confluence of gifts identified in Rod West found their fertile soil in the historical context and in the setting of Trinity Grammar School, aided by a supportive chair, gifted students and families, dedicated senior staff members, which included the outstanding educator such as Tim Wright from Shaw and Graham Anderson, and so many others, and a marvellous family who loved him and supported him. Rod West had little regard for risk assessment, almost none, and workplace health and safety preoccupations. Today, such an attitude could lead to reprimand or even removal from office. He led adventurously at times, as those of us who attended his famous Coogee Beach runs with Schoolhouse would readily attest. I well recall one evening swimming across Gordon's Bay in one such outing, bringing up the rear as I felt that I should. When I turned back to see young boarder Kar Kit Wong going down for his final breath. Kar Kit was a non-swimmer. Rod reflects in the Heart of Education, page 239, he says this, "I am grateful that the Lord saw me through, albeit by the skin of my teeth." Now, as the former head of Oxley College in Bowral and International Grammar School, David Wright once said to me, and some in this room would know David, he once said to me that the present world is guilty of neglect by overprotection. Even though he may be correct, such ideas are dangerous nowadays, and they're anathema for heads of schools. The pressure is the exact opposite. Avoid risk at all costs. The consequence, I want to suggest, is to drive leadership into safe but becalmed waters, where children find it harder to be inspired. Let me continue to pose the question, is such a model of leadership able to be replicated in the contemporary world? Can it survive now against these odds? The role of Dr. Janet West in her husband's success should be acknowledged. As the Heart of Education editor Graham Anderson observed, Janet's role was as influential as it was expansive. Again, quoting from Graham, hosting dinners, accompanying Rod to school events, also playing full-time parent, a doctorate in theology, women in the church, various ideas years ahead of their time, writing treatises in academia, fictional and historical drama for performance, ghostwriting and editing. The Heart of Education was substantially her work as well. And her famous shake of the status quo, poet, writer, feminist, public intellectual, as influential in her own right as her husband, yet not necessarily famous for baking the scones for the Ladies' Auxiliary. She found her place. Now, we are at a time where naturally the wives of heads play a very different role. Would Rod have been successful? It's an interesting thing to speculate. And the role of the partner, whether male or female, of a leader is something to be examined in future consideration. The world was also very different. When Rod West was appointed, Gough Whitlam was Prime Minister. The Fraser years gave way readily enough to the Hawke and Keating era which prevailed for most of his tenure at Trinity. Neville Wran and Rod Cavalier prevailed in New South Wales before the education reforms of Terry Metherell under Nick Greiner set independent schools into a kind of golden age. Expansion of enrolments, rapid developments in capital works and new opportunities in curriculum and travel provided unsurpassed riches for the lives of the student at the time. Australia celebrated its bicentenary with a renewed national sentiment. And whilst the financial recession and high interest rate environment of the late 1980s, which we all remember well as the recession we had to have, it tempered expansion for a little while, but this was a time of buoyancy for schools and for Trinity. And it was extremely fertile soil for Rod West to plant his vision. The Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse was still 2 decades from presenting its findings. In some ways, the Wood Royal Commission into the New South Wales Police Service in 1997 was the forerunner of the National Royal Commission into Institutional Response into sexual misconduct in schools. The public alarm about the status and influence of independent schools was voiced after Rod West retired in 1996. Even further, the information revolution, which has massively disrupted education, as well as other facets of contemporary experience, began its rise in the 1980s. Schools like Trinity enthusiastically embraced the opportunities by the developing computer laboratories. Anybody remember them? Well, they were the biggest thing ever. And we would book them, wait our turn for weeks before you could get in there and quarrel over who got to the computers first. The more untamable concomitant of the digital realm, namely social media, is generally acknowledged to have originated in 1997, a year after Rod's retirement from headship. I want to suggest that leadership in schools is vastly different now, robbing its leaders of much of the romantic flair that thrived in previous generations. The philosopher king is now but a memory, and good oratory has been undermined by the need for brevity and clear and clever command of visual media. I read with irony, for instance, Canon Curl's 1974 observation to Rod West. He said, "A headmaster has, in fact, great power. Council and parents willingly give it to him and wish him to use it, but do so sparingly and effectively." Now, the present situation might render that sentence differently. It might read like this: a headmaster has, in fact, great influence. Council and parents willingly give it to him or her and wish him or her to use it, do so, but use it constantly and effectively. Now, the truth of the matter is that past injustices and extravagances have perhaps rightly stripped institutional powers from its leaders and established a regulatory regime that past heads would probably have seen as intrusive and even insulting. But that is our world. The era of the demagogue head has probably passed forever. In a recent workshop conducted up at Barker by the Foundation Board, this little graphic attempted a kind of succinct description of the relevant shifts in Australia across this period. We have gone from trust in institutions to trust in individuals and the efficacy of the self. From a sense of an emerging global connection to popular movements within those global connections, of tolerating European migration into Australia to embracing diversity right across our country, where the HSC was regarded as sufficient, and it's now the MBA, where World Book Encyclopedia was the must-have in every family. If you really wanted your child to get along, now it's Google, and instant access to as much information as you can possibly find. An industrial workforce and an insular economy that was protected to a professional, transient and global economy, where luxury and turns from knowledge and word to experience, where to buy a house you once required 8 times your median income, now it's 19 times. The pressure's therefore on young people. Sorry for what? Why would we bother to acknowledge country, and what were we sorry for in the first place has given way to now routine acknowledgement of countries, as we have heard tonight. And private schools were once seen as evidence of aspiration and desire to lean in and make your contribution to your child and the child of others and their education. Now, the very existence of private schools is questionable, mired in the suggestion that it's serving only a portion of the culture. Hence, it is reasonable to suggest that the cultural and symbolic leadership that Rod West practiced with such artistry requires a new expression, a new metaphor for the contemporary setting. One of the things that I believe that the Alpha Crucis Chair will pursue is this question: whether a new metaphor, a new possibility, a new story can be found. But I want to actually shift now thirdly, and you'll be relieved to hear this is the shortest of the points, into a different suggestion, to borrow from T.S. Eliot, of which I know Rod would approve were he here, The heart is an infinitely gentle, infinitely suffering thing. And despite the immense changes in which we're now living, this has not changed. The approach to educational leadership of Rod West and the many who influenced him set the transmission of loving personality as his purpose under God. This has not changed. The call of Jesus to lead in love and service has not changed. Those qualities of Christ-like leadership have weathered all the turbulence of past generations and will continue to endure these difficult days and will continue to test us and nourish us if we fix our eyes on Jesus. Christian leadership, therefore, as expressed by Roderick West, and in his honour we now aspire, may be captured by these ideas. Christian leadership is virtuous. Its joy and delight is in God's kingdom and in his righteousness. Christian leadership is compassionate. It is moved to tears to see the suffering of another and summons us to heroic acts to prevent it. It may call us to drive 6 hours to see a grieving student. Christian leadership is service, doulos, ultimately to sacrifice all you are, and if necessary, all you have, for the lives of others. Lord, teach me to be generous. Teach me to serve you as you deserve, to give and not to count the cost, to fight and not to heed the wounds, to toil and not to seek for rest, to labour and not to ask for reward, except to know that I am doing your will. It is visionary. It calls on others to lift their eyes to a greater vision of God's kingdom and their part in achieving it. It is forgiving. So many times I watch Rod West sweep aside the errors and missteps of students, often to the chagrin of the common room. Love never keeps a record of wrongs. And finally, it is courageous. Even when the spirit is diminished and a rebellion has occurred in front of you, the cause of loving Christ's children continues to call us on. These qualities, I want to suggest, are enduring, and they can be adapted to all time zones and to all ages of human experience. They are the substance of the education of the heart, because it is in the living of them that we express the fullest version of our humanity and the source of our deepest fulfilment. The role of the head, then, is to create the learning society within a school, to nourish and shape its ethos, to establish its climate, protect it, and enable it, to be a shelter for the lives of others, to allow them to be the fullest version of themselves that they possibly can be, to protect young people and their teachers and their parents, to safely experience the richness of life every day, in every way. And we need experts, therefore, in content and skills to enliven the minds and deepen available knowledge. But following the pathway set by Rod West and others, we therefore need leadership that expresses now, a leadership for all ages, a leadership that is virtuous, compassionate, serving, visionary, forgiving, and courageous. I now conclude with several lines from one of the hymns that I remember Rod West loving so much when it thundered from the organ in the Trinity Chapel all those years ago. Whenever I hear this hymn, I am transported back to that chapel in Summerhill. I remember Rod West's exultant oratory, loving to pronounce the hymnists' names. Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf, he would say. I remember Rod West's call upon us to stand in the righteousness of Jesus, till we behold thee on thy throne. In thee we both stand, in thee alone. Our beauty this, our glorious dress, Jesus the Lord, our righteousness. Thank you very much.
Well, please, let's thank again Phillip Heath for his wonderful tribute to Rod West. Thank you. Hello, my name is Stephen Fogarty. I've recently become the graduate of a university college and the president of a university college. As a graduate of Moore College, alas, or thankfully, I don't have 3 points to bring you tonight. As the president of Alpha Christus College, it's a delight to be able to work with Christian educators and schools in this state and throughout the nation to pursue the glorious vision of classroom-ready teachers, teachers who are equipped and confident, and teachers who are committed to Christ. So it's a wonderful adventure to be involved in. I thank you for those of you who are partnering with us. Well, thank you very much, Philip, for a memorable presentation. Your enthusiasm and your admiration for Rod West is obvious, contagious, I think. I certainly want to know the man more now. In your words, he was your most important mentor, so we thank God for that. He was certainly one of the great names in Australian school education. It was inspiring to hear of his influence on your career, on you personally, and on the schools that you've been involved in. It's wonderful to contemplate the legacy of a life lived for Christ, and we do. It was delightful to hear about chocolate running down your sleeve on a hot afternoon in Summerhill. Wonderful, made the rest of us feel better about ourselves and our various embarrassing moments. It was reassuring to hear expressed the commitment to call as being the basis of a vocation in Christian education. It was suitably challenging to again hear the need for Christ-like servant leadership, and that's always relevant. And I think it was appropriate for you to acknowledge the significant contribution of Rod West's wife, Dr. Janet West. So thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Phillip Heath. Delightful to hear from you today. Again, let me acknowledge the family of Rod West who are with us today. Thank you for being with us. We acknowledge you. We hope that this has been memorable, heartwarming indeed for you. And Julia Anstey is going to come and speak on behalf of the West family. So please welcome her.
Well, thank you. It's a great honour for me to, on behalf of my family, to say thank you for this great honour tonight. And firstly, I'd like to say thank you to Trinity, and particularly to Tim Bowden for hosting us here and doing all the work and the beautiful supper that you put on. And Trinity always does these things so well, as I know very well, because I have a very happy son here in Year 12. And he loves being at Trinity, and I'm very grateful to the school. So could we thank the school for hosting tonight? Thank you. And I'd like to thank Phillip, or should I say Dr. Heath. I know he doesn't have the bit of paper, but he certainly has the track record to have that PhD. So thank you, Phillip, for your wonderful speech tonight. And it brought back so many beautiful memories of Trinity in the early days and my father and the impact he had on people. And you must have spent hours preparing that. So I want to thank you for your time in doing that. So could we thank Phillip? Thank you. And Alpha Crucis College and David Hastie, I'd like to thank you and acknowledge the honour that it is to for my father to have this professorial chair in his name of Christian education and leadership. I think it's most appropriate, and particularly being the institution that it is open to Christians of all different walks in life, and my father was a very ecumenical person, and he was very at home in a Catholic mass, particularly if it was in Latin, and he was equally at home in a charismatic Pentecostal setting as well. I remember when my sister and I as teenagers suggested that one night we should go down to CCC in DY at the time and check out this new church, and Phil Pringle, and from our rather quiet Anglican church in Summerhill, and we thought this would be interesting, so we went. And my sister and I were a little bit critical, I must admit, afterwards, with all the clapping and the raising of hands and things. And we said, "What did you think, Dad?" And he looked at us and he said, "I actually quite enjoyed it." I do remember those swims across Gordon's Bay that Philip mentioned. I actually did that once myself when I was 7 months pregnant with my first child, and having the spa and sauna at Giles Gym afterwards. And I remember that on that very dark headland one night, my father dropped his glasses, and he went to a dinner afterwards. He realised he didn't have his glasses, and he thought, "Oh, I've got to do 3 hours at the desk when I get home. What am I going to do?" So he went back to Gordon's Bay and the headland above it, and it was pitch black, and he thought, "I'm never going to be able to find these glasses." So he said to God, "God, can you show me where these glasses are?" And then he said he heard this really frustrated voice say to him, "Just look for the glint." And he looked down, and glinting in the grass were his glasses. And it was so typical of my father, the way he was able to hear the voice of the Spirit, and in quite audible ways like that was quite amazing. And it particularly showed in the way that he responded to people and that he wrote letters to people. Because so many people have said to me, "Your father once wrote me a letter, and I still have it." And I've been going through that correspondence since he died. I've read every one of those letters that he wrote and some that he received. And they weren't the most amazing letters. Some of them were only 3 sentences long, but they must have been very timely, and that they spoke to that person right where they were at that time, and that they had a powerful effect. And I think that was because he had the ability to hear the voice of God and to respond to it. And I know many of you are leaders in Christian education, and you probably hear those voices, and sometimes you ignore them. And I want to encourage you tonight to respond to those voices. So when you get that gee, that person did that well tonight, I should tell them that. Follow through on that, because I think they are the voice of God, and we often attribute them to our own thoughts, but I think they're often the Holy Spirit. My father had some wonderful mentors himself. Archbishop Lone, as was mentioned, my father modelled his voice on Marcus Lone, and another one called Eric Mortley, Reverend Eric Mortley. So that's where I'm sure my father got his intonation and his timbre from these august clergy. But in other ways too, they had a lot of time and looked up to them very much. But the 2 greatest influences in his life were females. His own mother, she believed in him as the youngest of 6 children, and she stood up to her husband and said, "This one is going to university," and she saved the money from the housekeeping to send him to university and to buy his books, and whatever he needed he got. And his father said, what's the point of a university education? Look at me. I'm a self-made man. I've got businesses and I don't need university. But she said he should go to university, and it was his wonderful legacy now that we're celebrating, thanks to his mother and also to my mother, Dr. Janet West. his strength. As the ducks of Abbotsleigh, my mother in her own right was an intellectual, probably greater than my father, yeah, most certainly. And he had the flamboyance, but Mum had that substance, and there was not a thing that my father did not pass by my mother, and also not a thing that she didn't proofread. So Dad's good proofreading is thanks to Mum. And she also she wasn't great on the scones, but she was great on the flowers in the chapel. Every week she did the flowers in the chapel. So all that work, I just want to acknowledge now, because I saw it, living with it, all that behind the scenes work. And Dad, as Philip has said, he wouldn't have done what he did without you. So can we acknowledge Mum and... So thank you. On behalf of the family, we do have some books that we'd like to donate for the foundation. So some of Dad's books we have tonight, and even Mum's books, her trio of plays we've brought tonight, and they'll be $30 each, and the proceeds will go towards the chair. And so thank you very much, and it's a great honour for the West family.
I think while I say a few words, if Sam and Luke can find those boxes of books and get them laid out, that would be helpful. Thank you, Julia, and for those comments at the end. And I think we have honoured Rod tonight, but I think we all treasure you as a family as well, and you have meant so much to us. Whether it was Galileo, your mum, helping me as a young debating schoolmaster when she came to adjudicate, and she was a much more reliable adjudicator than I was. But as well as that, I had the pleasure, the challenge, whatever it might be, of coaching Marcus and trying to manage the boarding house with Marcus and Michael while Mum and Dad were overseas on a trip. That was a great joy, as well as looking after Brutus from time to time. And Julia, we know that, the outstanding contribution you yourself have made to education. So I think the legacy lives and it goes on, and we're very fortunate for that. I just want to finish with a few words about the chair. So I better find the appropriate point in my phone. You see, Phil, you mentioned the onset of digital skills, and I've almost got some. Well, I wouldn't say I've caught up, but just to let you know as a group, the objectives of this chair, the Rod and Janet West Chair in Christian Leadership, are to establish a core of world-class expertise in the preparation and development of educational leaders and leadership to be able to take on some of the inspiring vision that Philip laid before us tonight. To develop, distribute and empower modes of transformative relational educational leadership in which schools put people first. And as we set about this, and I look around the room, I see many people who are engaged in Christian education in various forms, Anglican schools, Christian schools, and others in this challenge. And it's a wonderful opportunity for us to support this. You'll see on the screen that there is an opportunity to donate. Now, outside, we have some copies of The Heart of Education. We also have some copies of Janet's A Trio of Plays, and also The Crimson Baronia, which is a small book of Janet's poetry. If you would like to take a copy, and you hope that this applies in an audience largely made up of Christian educators, and on your honour, make a donation of, say, $30 for one of the books, or if you'd like to make another donation, we do intend to have some conversations in which we seek some more strategic gifting over time for this, and the committee will be doing some work on that. but we do want to get this going, so if you can do that, that would be much appreciated. Alpha Crucis is trying to do something different. I think those of us who read the financial pages or the business pages will know that one of the real discussions in this country and around the world at the moment is a crisis of talent. Many organisations find it quite a challenge to hire the people they want. And so as Rod set out in his own path all those years ago to find the people he wanted in his schools and to actively bring them in and recruit them, Alpha Crucis is trying to give an echo of that in their work as they try to find and encourage talented young Christian educators and Christians who might not have thought of education as the path that they ought to take, to get them linked into a professional program that gives them real experience from an early stage and really turns them out at the end of their process with the Alpha Crucis team, ready to go in the classroom, ready to be Christian witnesses, ready to set before young people the beauty of Christ. And if you want a conversation about that, may I draw your attention to the wonderful Caitlin Mundy up there, who works with the Teaching Schools Alliance. A number of schools represented in that are here this evening. If you want to talk to David, of course, about that as well. But there are quite a number of education independent schools are involved in that program, and we would hope that the next logical step then is not just to look at the development of young Christians for the teaching classroom, but young Christian leaders to take up leadership in our schools where they will make a great difference for the kingdom. We're back into the early Roman world, I think. No longer are we as Christians the dominant narrative in the world we live in, but my goodness, can we make an empire turn on its head if we get about living for Christ in education. Thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you for honouring Rod this evening. And sorry, I always get a bit sad when I think of Rod, for what a great man he was. But thank you for being here. And if you want to hang around for a chat afterwards, please do so. Don't forget those books and don't forget to donate. I'll find you.
Thank you so much for everyone who's contributed to this evening. That's the end of our proceedings. Please go and have a wonderful evening. I think there's still a bit of tea and coffee out there if you'd like to mingle. It's been a wonderful blessing. Thank you.